The Oklahoma Commission on the Status of Women welcomes you to the panel discussion on human trafficking in Oklahoma. I would now like to introduce our two discussants, Mike Snowden and Leslie Clingenpeel. If law enforcement does not properly screen suspected criminals, is it possible that a victim might get wrongfully prosecuted or convicted?
So that's a great question, Dr. Kahn, and thank you first to the OCSW for inviting me. Law enforcement screening has always been an issue, especially with human trafficking victims. The statute in the state of Oklahoma actually declares that human trafficking victims shall not be charged with criminal acts while they were being trafficked. So the issue with that is there has to be a certain amount of cooperation from a survivor or victim. That has to be an open and frank discussion between law enforcement and the victim to disclose that condition. So different jurisdictions handle things in different ways, but they are taught, law enforcement has been taught for the past decade at the police academy level and in continuing in services since then, that no prosecution shall ensue for any victim of human trafficking for, frankly, most crimes. So that screening is important, difficult, and a little more complicated than I would like, but it is being worked.
My next question for you is, what is the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling?
Human smuggling is a consensual crime in that all parties involved are consenting to violate the law. And it typically includes the transportation of someone from point A to point B with their consent. In fact, oftentimes they pay to be in that situation, and both parties, the transporter and the transportee, are involved in a violation of federal law. It's an area that state and local law enforcement do not have jurisdiction in. Human smuggling, it's contractual and consensual. So it's much different from human trafficking, where vulnerable people are exploited by someone else for profit. That's the biggest difference between those two.
As we all know, human trafficking continues to be an epidemic in Oklahoma and across the world, really. So how do such practices continue to exist in spite of the regulations implemented by mainstream authorities?
And I've argued for the past decade or more that you simply cannot legislate morality. You can pass as many laws as you care to, and some of them are useful and some of them benefit us as a society. But despite those laws, people will engage in immoral and illegal practice. It's a combination of not just statutory regulation, but teaching our children from the time that they're able to understand it onward, that they are worth more than putting themselves in dangerous situations. They are worth more than being vulnerable. And it is not okay for any member of our society to rent for their own uses another person. It's simply not socially acceptable. We have done that with other things in our lives. We did that, and this is a silly example, but we did that with cigarettes. But in 50 years ago, it was not uncommon in schools, on airplanes, in medical facilities, on television, and now you don't see that anymore. That didn't solve the issue, but it certainly is part of it. So education is a huge issue, huge part of that. Statutorily, it's also an issue, but it's mostly about protecting our vulnerable. I would add this, and recently it has come to more problematic than anything, but the economy is making people extremely vulnerable. We have difficulty as a culture, as a society, in paying living wages to young people who are often in school or unskilled labor. Recently, several websites have validated my claim that those folks are having a very, very difficult time making a living and are vulnerable to human traffickers who prey specifically on them. So this social condition is extremely complicated, but it's about the economy, it's about education, and it also includes statutory requirements as well.
So as our panelists emphasized, we must have conversations with children in our circle of influence about human trafficking, about what makes them vulnerable. Children are often told to be aware of their surroundings and to not talk to anyone they don't know. With that being said, what other measures can we take or use in keeping children, teenagers, safe from human trafficking predators in our malls, our schools, and college campuses?
That we have kind of taught our kids stranger danger, right? But as we know about human trafficking, oftentimes and almost always, it is actually someone that they know or that they have come to know. And so we really need to be having raw and transparent conversations. And I think bringing education even into the public sphere in schools about what to recognize when someone is trying to coerce you or when they are presenting you with a fraudulent scenario, and letting people know that they really are still vulnerable even if they begin to think that they're trusting this person. I also think having very candid conversations with children about consent and bodily autonomy, and helping them to truly understand that they have the right to decide how their body is used, and if anyone can violate that without their consent, that is not okay. And so I think upfront education is very important. I think that's something we need to get serious about, having those conversations in our homes and in our schools. So, and even on college campuses, ensuring that human trafficking isn't what it appears to be, or the misconceptions that were so very laid out in the very beginning of our presentation. Helping people to not become victims so that they understand truly what trafficking is. So that they can recognize those signs early on and not excuse it away as an acceptable behavior.
The next question for you, Leslie, is: has globalization led to the spread of human trafficking?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I certainly don't want to take I'm the expert on this answer approach to this, but I would say I don't know that it's led to it, but I certainly think it's lent to it. Our world is now much smaller and at our fingertips. And when we have access, again, when we think about vulnerable people groups being targets to become human trafficking victims, when there is political upheaval, when there is economic distress in different places, and we have such easy access now to the world, it certainly opens up a much shorter line to a victimizer, to a potential victim. I don't know that it's necessarily led to it. I could let Mr. Snowden speak to that if he has some more educated response to that, but I do think it has certainly lent to it.
The world is a very small place now because of the internet and because of better communication than we've ever had before. And really, in Oklahoma, we're a reflection of what's going on around us. As the economy worsens in other countries, say Mexico or Guatemala or any country, that people try to come here because no matter how poorly we see our economy, it is still we're still probably the richest country in the world. And so they come here and they are very vulnerable to labor traffickers because they will unfortunately do jobs that Americans just will not do or don't see themselves doing. So when you approach it from a labor trafficking standpoint, it's all cyclical and we're all dependent on each other. As different economies fail, it stresses our economy as well. That's why I think prevention programs and aid programs to foreign countries pay off on the other end of that equation by lessening the likelihood of victimization in this country.